So before we dive in, I just wanted to sort of take stock of where we are. A celebrity billionaire has become the voice of ordinary Americans. China proclaims to be the biggest democracy in the world. Russia has become the new role model for how to invade your neighbor. The German government has collapsed. The French government is in a permanent state of near collapse, which means that Italy is now officially the most stable democracy in Europe. Now, democracy is something that's on many people's mind. Many Europeans are worried about the state of democracy in America at the moment. J.D. Vance is very worried about the state of democracy in Europe, as we heard today. Something that's going on and that I hope we can touch on today is this fight over what makes a democracy a democracy. And I have a great lineup of people here today who have all been dealing with this issue in their various countries. I'd like to come to you first, Elissa, since the whole world is currently trying to make sense of the reality of Trump #2. You are a senator and you are a Democrat. So I guess I want to start by asking you whether our premise is fair. Is this a crisis of democracy or is this a crisis of the Democrats? Because Mr. Trump, of course, got a mandate, a clear mandate, and even turnout was up. So is democracy perhaps doing fine?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me and thanks for including me in the panel. I think, just by the sheer scope of instances and countries you just went through, I think it demonstrates that we have a crisis of democracy. I don't think it's just the United States, although certainly we do in the United States. I think it's something that's going on globally where people are not feeling the benefits of a democracy in the way that we were taught. And while I am a Democrat, I also won on the same ballot just now in November with Donald Trump. My voters voted for Donald Trump and Elissa Slotkin on the same ballot. And there I can tell you the mandate was not about ignoring the Constitution or putting a broligarch in charge of the government. It was inflation was too high, prices were too high, and I'm going to vote for the person who says that they can lower those costs. So I think it's important not to conflate a mandate on lowering prices, which is yet to be seen, versus a mandate to do some of the things that are going on right now, which, constitute, I think, close to a constitutional crisis in the United States.
So it's very important to zero in on this difference. We often have these ideological swings, but you're saying this change of the guards is actually something much more fundamental. They are challenging constitutional democracy itself. How confident are you that in 4 years' time, those checks and balances will have survived?
Well, I think we're in the middle of this first 100 days of President Trump, and he is absolutely pushing the boundaries of our Constitution and in some cases rolling right over them. Our courts have been involved. Obviously, the legislature is involved, and it's yet to be seen how he reacts. Does he get pushed back and we're now back in the boundaries, or does he just keep going, rifling over those? So I think it's yet to be seen. But I think what is important, again, from the place I come from, not every single person is sitting around their table talking about the ideological shifts in constitutional democracies. They're looking at the price of food, the price of gas. They can't get a new home. And they feel that very acutely. So, you can't pay your rent with democracy. So while people may not be thinking about it every single day, that doesn't mean we don't have a responsibility to have conversations like this, but it's just a reminder that we need to have the conversations outside of our capitals and bring home these ideas to people's pocketbooks and their kids. Because at the end of the day, at least in the United States, that is how people vote.
And I actually want to come to that point in a more sort of in a deeper way and actually have a bigger conversation about the sort of what we can do and what in particular center-left parties can do, because my sense from reporting in countries like Germany, the UK and France, people feel almost betrayed more by the center-left than the center-right, because center-left parties always said that they would have their back. But I want to go first to you, Rafał. You are the mayor of Warsaw. You're also running for president in your country. And Poland has been here before. You have had 2 terms of democratic backsliding and illiberal democracy. It would be interesting to know what your advice would be as the US is entering this phase now. What would you recommend how to safeguard checks and balances at this point?
Well, I'm not going to be so presumptuous as to give advice to anyone, but I can tell you that, yeah, we've been there. And when it started in Poland, the democratic backsliding 9 years ago when the conservative populists won, lots of my friends in the US and in Western Europe thought that this is just a Polish-Hungarian problem. And I was telling them this is a problem with democracy. You know, there's no longer a differentiation between the right and the left. You know, it's a question of rising polarization. It's a question of social media. The algorithms work the way they work, which means that they actually emphasize conflict. And of course, it's time of multiple crises with which we have to deal, and the time of parties which are anti-establishment, which are winning everywhere. So we need to deal with that. And of course, Poland is a good case because we proved to be very resilient. And at the end of the day, the Democrats won. We still have one more election to go because we need to win the presidential elections to sort of close the cycle and entrench democracy in Poland. But we've won. Why? Because we have a very strong civil society. We had very strong non-governmental organizations, and we were very smart in the 90s when we've regained full independence after the communist rule, because we really devolved power. So there's a lot of power in the hands of the local governments. And it so happens that populists do not really win, regional elections that easily. So most of the power in the cities and in the regions was in the hands of the Democrats, which staunchly defended our principles. And also because, those crises made us very careful and resilient. And at least there was an agreement, even with the populists. We were on the same page when it came to security, when it came to strengthening our defense capabilities and so on and so forth. So there was this thread of understanding, which of course was so crucial in the moment of crisis and when Russia invaded Ukraine.
I mean, after these two terms, when a lot of rollback happened, when, particularly in the media and in the judiciary, what would you say, how easy it is to come back from that? Because that is the other concern, of course, and it's important perhaps to educate American voters and others about, these are institutions that took a long time to build. And we're seeing a lot of potential damage being done in the first few weeks already. So I guess the question to you is, how are you doing in reversing some of the damage that was done in those two terms? And how easy is it actually to repair institutions?
I mean, the real problem is that, populists sometimes do not have any qualms about breaking the Constitution. So if someone is breaking the Constitution, what do you do? I mean, we do have our checks and balances, and some of them held pretty strongly in Poland, right? But, I mean, the populists were simply breaking the Constitution. So now our problem is that we are doing it, but it's difficult to revert some of the things that they were doing because our president holds the right of veto, and we want to do it by the book. We want to introduce bills which are going to introduce changes back to where we were for example, when it comes to the independence of the judiciary and so on and so forth. It is difficult, but we're doing it. I mean, the important thing is that the dualism, if someone breaks the Constitution and, for example, nominates new judges, breaking all the rules, or nominates cronies for the Constitutional Court in Poland who were not even judges, I mean, to reverse that is very difficult, and it's of course terrible for democracy. It's terrible for the rule of law, for economy, and so on and so forth. So we've proposed a way out to the president, but he was not ready to accept it. So we are slowly reverting to the rule of law, and we reverted in many cases, but in order to entrench that, we need to win the presidential elections.
Well, and that's where you come in. If you don't, which is a possibility, would that just mean that in the judiciary, that would just become a fact of life? You wouldn't be able to do anything about that constitutionally? You wouldn't be able to reverse those?
Well, unfortunately, yes. Unfortunately, that would mean that we would have, to dual state with two types of judges and so on, which is untenable for democracy. And fortunately, as I said, local democracy, the media, held strong. I mean, Poland is a completely different case than Hungary, because we devolved power, because our society held strong. Even, I always give this comparison. Warsaw's budget is $7 billion a year. Budapest is just $1 billion. And they just, are fully reliant on subsidies from government. So it shows you that the devolution of power, so for example, we when the government cut spending to non-governmental organizations, to free culture, independent culture and so on, we started financing it. So we were much stronger because we made smart decisions 35 years ago. But it's, of course, the onslaught of populism. It's, we've never tested it before. So, I mean, there's one thing when you're trying to stretch the limits of democracy, stretch the limits of the Constitution. It's something completely different when the populists just break it, break all the rules. Because, how are you going to make sure it doesn't happen again? It's just a question of investing in education. In investing, like, kids need to know that they have to verify the data that they see. So this is really, I mean, something different. It's not just meddling with the Constitution or with the law. It's investing in public opinion, education, and so on and so forth. Non-governmental organizations, local government. That's the only hope for fighting populism in the long-term strategy. It's
a long-term strategy. And Stora, I would like to come to you now because Scandinavia, you're part of the world. I mean, you're the Prime Minister of Norway. One, of those countries that we all look to and think, wow, they're rich, they have great welfare states, they've sort of got something right. So, in some ways, it is a haven of social democracy, it long has been, but even in your patch of the world, the far-right parties are gaining, anti-immigrant parties are gaining ground. But as somebody who stands for a party that is on the center-left, tell us a little bit what that message is that the left needs to stand for. How can the left, which is globally in crisis, I think is fair to say, and has been losing the trust and the votes of its traditional constituency, working class people, which partly is because that term has lost meaning somewhat in today's economy. But what is it that the left needs to understand about today's politics in order to be attractive again?
Well, it's a big question. I'll try to come at it from a few angles here. First of all, I think all societies and all political systems are under tremendous pressure from technology, from what the Munich Conference has identified as the main challenge in today's world, pretty similar to what the World Economic Forum did, putting on number one misinformation, fake news. And all of that coming at us at the core of democracy, which I think is a huge challenge, especially when political parties take a grab at that approach to politics to really manipulate facts. So that is pressure on the social fabric, so to say.
Although just to jump in there, I mean, J.D. Vance, I thought, had a point today when he said that kind of interference only really works when there's at least some basis to the grievance and the problems that misinformation hits into, right? I mean, there are some underlying issues.
Absolutely. So that's what I want to come to, and where I believe that the left, the social democracy that I represent, really, we have the elements to put together the answer. But I think the senator pointed at this. You don't eat democracy for breakfast. It is not democracy that fixes your children when they don't succeed at school. So this is about the real reality of what your daily life is. If you go through, as we do as a political party in cooperation with sister parties in our part of the world, the number one theme on people's concern this last year has been cost of living and purchase power going down. And until you fix that and give security to that, everything else becomes a bit irrelevant. And you become vulnerable to misinformation, to quick fix, which does not necessarily reflect. So for me, I think what we've had over this last year with the inflation coming back, it's a cancer in the system functioning of democracies, speedily going up and rapidly coming down, it should be said, but it is destabilizing the social fabric of our countries. So for my government, it has been top priority to get inflation down, and in the meantime, have social policies that really are there to make welfare state work for those who really need it. So we have taken down the price of kindergartens, childcare. We have increased pensions for those with the lowest incomes throughout, and a lot of social spending on that side of the equation, so that people can see that we are working for their position, their dignity, their ability to manage their lives. When you get back stability, and we've been able to go through that inflation phase without increasing unemployment, but still in our country, which is a stable country, you can sense the instability that inflation is creating because cost of living is getting out of control. So that's where we have to get back. Then I think the second dimension for me here, if I may, is that, and I'm picking the example from Timothy Snyder's recent book on freedom. He was in Oslo and he was on the panel, I was on a panel with him, which is this balance between freedom to and freedom from. Mm. And if freedom only becomes a discussion of freedom from, we are not safeguarding democratic sustainability. There has also have to be freedom to. Freedom to take an education, freedom to get a decent job, freedom to be at work with decent work, not to be, put aside. And Schneider's example is from this Ukrainian village that had been deoccupied. Russians had pulled back. So the question is, are they free now? Well, they are free from occupation, but they are not free to enjoy what you need to do to enjoy a decent life. So I think these issues about securing people's ability to live decent lives, combined with managing their daily economic outcome, safety of their children, investing in, sports, leisure, and activity for children, so they get, to be involved in community. That is part of where the centre-left should be, and that's where we aim to be, and that's where we also aim to win elections on that basis.
And I see this sort of fundamental dilemma in this argument, which I think makes a lot of sense. People do want security. They want public services that work. They want free and good, strong public education, all of which requires, man and woman power. And in Europe, increasingly, immigration, because, our populations are shrinking. And we're faced with this, on the one hand, voters who are very hostile, quite opposed to immigration, and at the same time they want welfare states that function, and they want growth. And both for functioning welfare states and for economic growth, you need some immigration. So how do we, as politicians, particularly on the left, sell that?
But I think, here's one issue I have with the Vice President's speech. I have a few, but this one, let's mention this one. He speaks as though we are not focused on immigration in Europe. I mean, this is the big theme in every country, that we want to have control of our borders, we want to have controlled immigration, and this is a key theme, I think, all across Europe. But then he makes the remark that there was a significant increase of immigrants, unvetted immigrants to Europe in recent years. Where did they come from? Ukraine. Look to Poland. 2 million or more Ukrainians have been accepted into Poland because there is a bloody war going on, which he did not mention, which I think is not really addressing reality which is coming to Europe. But we have to, in Europe, country by country, but also as a community, to have a very thorough discussion about controlled immigration. And as you say, we cannot close Europe, because Europe's challenge in the future will probably to have enough people to do the jobs we need to do.
And to pay taxes.
Exactly. Yeah. But again, I think that the fact that we have, in my country, we have 100,000 people for Ukraine now. If you take that per capita, it would mean in a German setting 2 or 3 million. Mm. In every municipality. So, how do you? This is a part of the solidarity that you have to mobilize spontaneously, and those Ukrainians coming, men, women, and children, they will turn up at some kindergarten, in some school, at some medical office, and there will be discussion, what are they doing here? Are they taking our places? But if you really explain why we do this in this very dire situation, it can also be understood. Mm. And I'm proud to see that, that has not unleashed, negative reactions in my country.
So, Jonas, we'll come back to you in a bit, but I want to go to Jay now. There's one of my favorite stories about Mahatma Gandhi was when he traveled to Britain, and somebody asked him, what do you think about Western civilization? And he said, I think it would be a good idea.
We're still waiting.
Yeah. So let me paraphrase that slightly. As we're having this discussion, this tortured discussion, what do you think about Western democracy?
Well, look, before I do that, let me, because I think I appear to be an optimist in what is a relatively pessimistic panel, if not room. So I'll begin by sticking up my finger, and don't take it badly, it's the index finger. The mark you see on my nail is a mark of a person who's just voted. We just had an election in my state, just over. Last year we had a national election. In Indian elections, roughly 2/3 of eligible voters vote. At the national election, electorate of about 900 million, about 700 million voted. We count the votes in a single day. Nobody disputes the result after it's announced. And if you look, and by the way, from the time we started voting in the modern era, 20% people more vote today than they did decades ago. So the first message that somehow democracy is in trouble globally, worldwide, I'm sorry, I have to differ with it. I mean, right now, we are living well, we are voting well, we are optimistic about the direction of our democracy, and for us, democracy is actually delivered. Senator, you said that, democracy doesn't put food on your table. Actually, in my part of the world, it does. Because it actually, today, because we are a democratic society, we give nutrition support, food support to 800 million people. And for whom that is a matter, of how healthy they are and how full their stomachs are. So the point I want to make is, look, different parts of the world are going through different conversations. Please do not assume that this is some kind of universal phenomenon. It is not. There are parts where it is working well. Maybe there are parts where it's not. And the parts which are not, I think people need to have an honest conversation about why it's not. I would argue that as to an extent as someone dispassionately viewing it, which is your question, there are some problems. A lot of it is is an accumulated problem of the model of globalization that we've followed for the last 25, 30 years. I think a lot of chickens have come home to roost. Yes, there are issues, but from our perspective today, for us, democracy is delivered. We have a visibly less elitist society. We have one where the public has faith in the political process, where actually every election, in a way, has been a kind of a verdict on the quality of governance. That, I told you we just voted in one. My party won that election. We were in the opposition earlier. We had a national election. My party won that election too, and we were incumbents. And we feel, if the Prime Minister Modi got elected for the third time, the ruling party got elected, and to a large extent it is because of the delivery through democratic systems. So it is healthy, it is well, maybe not all over the world, but let's not make that universal.
No, I think that's a good point. And in fact, I was going to ask you a follow-up question here before I'm going to open it up to the floor. So do get your questions ready. Because we in the West, for lack of a better term, in Europe and the United States, I think we tend to sort of preoccupy ourselves with ourselves a lot, especially these days. And I think, all the middle powers that are increasingly important, especially in our foreign policy, in the various conflicts that we're involved in, for better or for worse, I think they have their own views of what systems work and what don't. We used to assume in the West that our system is the one that everybody wants to adopt over time. So I guess the question to you, India, of course, being the largest democracy in the world. Is your sense among your counterparts in, again, for lack of a better term, the global south, that democracy is still a system people aspire to, countries aspire to, or are there now powerful alternatives, such as the Chinese model, which may be more attractive to people?
Well, look, to an extent, all big countries are unique to an extent, but we would certainly hope, to the extent we think of democracy as a universal aspiration, ideally a reality, but at least an aspiration. It is in large part because India chose a democratic model after independence. And it chose a democratic model because we had fundamentally a consultative, pluralistic society. Now, there was a time, and I have to say this in all honesty, where West treated democracy as a Western characteristic and was busy encouraging non-democratic forces in the global south. It still does. In many cases, I can point to some very recent ones, where actually everything that you say you value at home, you don't practice abroad. So I do think the rest of the global south will view, the successes and the shortcomings and the responses of other countries. They will also ask themselves which ones of them they relate to. I would argue that in many ways, India, because it's historically been an open society, one very much linked with the world, many countries of the global south are more likely to say the Indian experience is more transposable to their societies than perhaps those of others. So I do think in our progress as a democracy, the fact that, for all the challenges that we've had, even at a low income, we have stayed true to the democratic model, which is almost, if you look at our part of the world, we're pretty much the only country that has done that. So I think it's something the West should look at, because if you do want democracy eventually to prevail, it's important the West also embraces successful models outside the West.
Are there any questions in the hall at the moment? Yes, the lady in the front.
Trudy Rubin, a columnist from the Philadelphia Inquirer. When Vice President Vance spoke today, he seemed to be arguing that democracy requires almost illiberal values. I would be curious to hear about how you all on the stage took his remarks. Did you see it as an outspoken attack on European democracy, a sort of declaration of war? And when you look at the United States now, as the foreign minister said, sometimes we used to assume that our model was the only one. But when you look at the U.S. model now, does it have anything anymore to offer the rest of the world as a model?
Do you want to take that?
Well, I can tell you just one thing, that we in Poland have an experience with different models, because, I grew up under communism. So, I don't have to be, and the society in Poland doesn't have to be really convinced about the merits of democracy, because we know what it means to live under an illiberal regime. Our problem is, and I think that this is the gist of our discussion, is that it is sometimes very difficult to explain to the people what democracy really means, because it's so abstract. And, when people use the word like, the judiciary, the rule of law, and so on and so forth, people are lost. As the Prime Minister was saying, people think about the economy, they think about the security, and so on and so forth. So it is the most difficult task for us is to explain that when someone is proposing an illiberal regime, that would actually mean taking our basic freedoms away from us. And I would submit to you that that's why we were successful in Poland, because we were able to tell the people that this is not just some abstract rule of law, but that by introducing a medieval anti-abortion law, the basic freedoms were taken from our women to decide their lives and to decide on their health. That by introducing indoctrination in schools, we were coming back to the communist system, where we would want to have a school which teaches us skills, not indoctrinates our children. That when populists, talk about national interest, somehow, quite often, they prove to be completely ineffective when it comes to influencing the outside world, because they cannot construct the winning coalitions that you need to be constructing in order to actually promote your interests. That if you want to really talk about migration, that you cannot simply allow populists to hijack that issue, because that can be dealt with by Democrats as well. And that we should be focusing on some of those most important concerns. And I think that our task today is not to sort of catch others, and sort of interpret their words, but to focus on what we can do in order to prove that we are better. We, on the Democratic side, are actually better at resolving issues, and that we can be as effective or even more effective at providing security, at providing growth. This is the winning argument, and that's what we should be focusing on. Because if at the end of the day, ultimately, the question is whether my life was better under a different regime, then the only winning argument is that we can provide it, and we are not taking at the same time the people's basic freedoms away. So this is the argument, and I think that turning to us is always a good point in question, because we lived under both regimes, so we can tell the difference.
But just maybe to reinforce the sense, maybe to sharpen almost a little bit more what we just heard as a question is, was there anything in what J.D. Vance said about the shortcomings, supposedly, of European democracy that spoke to you? Was there something, for example, in this idea that we freeze out far-right parties in certain countries, in this country, for example, with the firewall? Are we afraid? Are we too afraid? Are we perhaps not? Are we more liberal than actually democratic sometimes?
Well, I think on that one, first of all, I think what is refreshing is that when we come together here, there is freedom of speech. And the Vice President can decide that this is how he would like to address his audience. He likes to raise these themes. And although we may disagree, that is fair enough. I think, not addressing some of the key security issues that we face today is a missed opportunity. I don't agree with him that what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in Russia, what's happening in China is less important than the presumed loss of freedom of speech in Europe. I disagree. The other element which I think is interesting here is that, coming from the US perspective, reading a parliamentary system in Europe, it is different. So this party is free to run in elections in Germany, but other parties are free to tell their voters whether they are, open to cooperate or not. This is part of parliamentarism. I run a minority government in Norway. I have to find solutions in parliament, and I seek solutions where I can have them with parties that share my platform. That is how that works. So I think, this was a kind of a simplified approach which I don't share. But what I do share is that constantly focusing on, accepting different views, accepting even outrageous views in our debate, accepting that people have faith and beliefs. He made points of that. I think that's what we should remind each other. He is here now speaking to Europe. If we were going to your country to speak about what we see in the US about, tech dominance, is there access to media for people? What's happening to our youth under control of social media? Is that, challenging freedoms and democracy? I think that's also a discussion to be had, but, not here.
Jay.
Can I make two quick comments here? One, look, I would challenge the equation of, liberalism in a kind of an international way with democracy. I do think different societies have their own cultures, their own values, their own ways of doing things. And the idea that there is some kind of one truth and one judgment and one norm, and that should be preached propagated, evaluated, and judged. I think that is one of the big issues we're having today in politics. And it is done by think tanks, it's done by people who do ratings, it is done by newspapers. So I think there is a reaction in many parts of the world to self-appointed custodians, people who've never fought an election, who are nothing to do with democracy, actually telling the rest of the world what is right and what is wrong in democracy. And I think it is, to me, inevitable that it will be challenged. My second issue, is, look, every country has its mainstream politics. It has its outliers. Okay. If I were to look, for example, at how much Europeans, Westerners, reach out to outliers in those societies. If I were to look at what do Western ambassadors do in India, if my ambassadors did a fraction of that, you would all be up in arms. So I think there are double standards here.
I think it's interesting, and I think, to your point, of course, within a parliamentary system, every party is fully in its right to refuse to cooperate with another party. The problem is that some of these formerly outlier parties are now the second biggest parties in our democracies, and their voters, perhaps rightly, resent the fact that they're being ostracized from government. And in this country, in Germany, and I'm German, I can say this, it goes so far as to cause a scandal when you're trying to pass a bill and you pass that bill with votes from that party. So it goes into a sphere that is very hard to explain to voters, right? I just want to give the audience another chance. There's another lady here, and then the gentleman. Maybe we have those two questions together, and then...
Thank you. Maggie Feldman-Pilch from the Wilson Center. Over the last day and a half, we've heard so much about this need to explain how democracy pays rent better. And Senator Slotkin, I don't know that anyone does that better than you. As you mentioned, voters voted for you and President Trump at the same time. You flipped your district when you ran for Congress. You did it even by a greater margin the second time, and now you're a senator. No one seems to be able to answer this question of how do we make democracy and national security make sense. Would you mind giving us a quick little lesson?
Yeah, I did not pay her to say that. So I would just say, and again, I'm not trying to say anything about anyone else's democracy. I'm just saying in the United States, democracy is inextricably linked to a strong middle class. We believe, and no one in our country has lived under anything other than our democracy, that the thing that that democracy allowed was that anyone from anywhere could do well and their kids could do better. So when they don't feel like that's happening, they feel like the entire system is broken. Right or wrong, that's just how it is, particularly in the industrial Midwest, where we make things, we grow things, and we used to be paid much more handsomely for those things. So when people can't buy a house, when they can't send their kids to summer camp, when they don't understand how they're going to, send their kid to college, they start questioning the entire system. And that anger and that frustration leads them down paths where they're less generous with their neighbors. They don't have the ability to as easily to say, okay, I feel secure, so I'm okay with you being secure. There's an entire theory of the civil rights movement in the United States that we were able to do what we did in the late 60s because of how strong our middle class was after World War II, that people felt secure enough to say, you having rights doesn't take away my rights in a diverse democracy. So I just have seen the inverse happen, that as people feel desperate, they don't feel generous with their fellow man, and they start blaming the system of democracy. So we have to explain, and I think the Polish example is super interesting. We have to be able to say that if we don't have a reliable justice system, here's what's going to happen. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it will come to your doorstep, right? If we don't have the financial, right now we just are in the middle of taking down our basically financial police on our big banks. If we don't have that, then it's the customer, the consumer who gets screwed, not the big bank. We need to communicate those things. We're struggling clearly with how to do that.
Is it just communication? Because this is, to me, kind of the crux of the issue. And it's a question I ask about the Democrats, about, the Labour Party in Britain, about, the Social Democrats in this country. Did you guys sort of lose your way when you kind of signed up to the neoliberal consensus, and you went too far with the deregulation and the kind of free market religion almost that, the Reagan-Thatcher consensus brought in? And was there something in this hyper-globalized, financialized economy that we've gone for that actually undermined your ability, even if you want to, keep that middle class strong, to keep that middle class strong? And do you need to rethink that?
There is most definitely a question mark on globalization, especially from a place like the Midwest where we feel like we've lost so many jobs. There is a question every day about our relationship with China. There's a question every day about NAFTA and whether we should have signed that free trade agreement. Every single day in my state, that's a question. And that is why you're seeing this conversation in the United States about tariffs, including on friends. It's why you see a growing sort of spirit of protectionism. It's because people are fundamentally rethinking whether globalization allows us to have the secure future. I think that's an issue of real debate. I don't think there's a black and white there. And I can tell you tariffs on a place like Canada would screw Michigan before any other state in the country. But I think that's a legitimate conversation about whether democracy continues to thrive in a globalized world plus social media. That's a big-ass question.
Yeah.
But so, I mean, that's why the response is this, that basically we, on the Democratic side, we have to prove that when it comes to providing, economy, when it comes to providing security, that we can be even better than the populists and more effective. And that we are not going to take away the freedoms, but we hear what the people are saying because the world is changing. I mean, we've seen it after COVID with Russia attacking Ukraine, with more assertive, to put it mildly, China and so on and so forth. We have to, learn the lessons and tell the people, listen, we hear you. It's not just the populists who hear you, and we are going to deal with that. We are going to focus on migration, we're going to focus on the economy, we're going to focus on security, but we are the ones who actually are going to deliver that in a much more effective manner, and we are not going to undermine your freedoms. And, this is the thing, to concentrate on the issues. Because if you say, if there's any lesson, and from Vance and so on and so forth, it is true that sometimes the populists were even better at framing the issues. They were not very, and at least pretending that they were hearing the people. But then, of course, they were terrible at providing, the real solutions to that. So we need to prove that we can hear, we can frame the issues, but we are better at solving them, at the same time not undermining the individual freedoms. That's the name of the game.
I want to end, and I'm literally out of time. I just want to end with like a very quick, just because again the U.S. looms so large in this new administration. Alyssa, if you wouldn't mind, is there something that the Democrats can learn from Trump?
Oh, yes. I think I'll be very frank, and I've said this openly about my own party. We speak about issues, and maybe others do too, as if we're speaking from the faculty lounge, right? It's an esoteric intellectualism around issues that just doesn't translate if you're not a good communicator. It just doesn't, right? We write 11-paragraph policy papers to explain something. Donald Trump fits it on a hat, right? And people would come up to me in the state of Michigan. They're like, you're a Democrat. What's your hat? Donald Trump was Make America Great Again. What's the Democrat's hat?
What's your hat?
Good question. I think there's a bunch of different things that I used in my own election, but without getting into it. But to me, it is just like team normal. Let's just be realistic, serious, common sense people, team normal people. I don't care if you're a Democrat or Republican. Just let's solve some problems.
I'd get that hat.
But I think Donald Trump and simple communication, clearly, not to mention his use of social media.
Thank you so much. I'm aware that you're going to come and talk to us now. Do you want? Okay, I got to give this guy his shot because I did promise it. Would you mind just one last question? I'm sorry. I thought it was such a nice. Yeah. because I did promise.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to, I'm Stepan Safarian from Armenia. First of all, thank you very much for this amazing, fascinating discussion. Since we are talking about democratic resilience, all the panelists, as their countries knows, my country, our country, Armenia, faced a lot of attacks by autocracies and hybrid threats coming from autocratic countries. And we appreciate your support in meeting these challenges in Armenia. But coming back to the statements made on this floor by U.S. Vice President Vance, one of his policy recommendations was obviously about not being afraid of external interference, as he just described in case of Romania and other countries. So if this is the case, and this is the approach of the new American administration, then what's your recommendation for our countries and for further dialogue with the United States, how to face these hybrid threats if United States is not supporting limitation of some or closing of windows for hybrid threats? Thank you very much.
That feels like another panel. Does anyone, which I think we should have, actually, it's a super interesting panel. We're out of time, but if somebody has a 10-second answer.
No, at the NATO summit last year, we agreed as NATO parties that hybrid threats are real threats. They are security threats. So I think the thing to say that, if you are vulnerable to foreign intervention, you have a weak case because you should be able to resist that. I think that is denying some hard realities that we all face. So we have to be better at identifying hybrid threats and attributing hybrid threats. And we are becoming better, but we have to work on that together also with your fine country and with the Prime Minister, who we know well.
Jay, you get the last word.
Yes. I think I can tell you in India, we've been dealing with external interference for a long time. I'd be happy to give you a tutorial on how to deal with it.
I like that. Thank you very much, and thank you to this great panel.